All right. Well, hopefully you enjoyed a nice musical interlude by Queen. So the reason why I have this embedded is because, at the very beginning where you have the stomp, stomp, clap, I play the piece in class and then try to see whether I can lure people into doing the stomp, stomp, clap. Like I start doing it. I start kind of like smiling at other people, trying to get them to do it with me, trying to get them to join me in the stomp, stomp, clap, right? So the purpose of that is to illustrate the effects of others on individual performance, right? I try and get the group to do it. I have to say there are some pretty heavy holdouts in a face-to-face class who just will not conform. Don't ask anybody to do it, right? I try and just do it through conformity. I'm doing it. If somebody else does it, I smile at them and encourage them. I'm like, it's fun, right? Try and get people to do it just through, sort of a little peer pressure-y kind of conformity. But the reason why people can stand back is because, for one thing, the music's coming through the speakers in the classroom, so it's pretty loud. You can only see the people in a classroom who are ahead of you, right? Like I can see everybody, but for a student, you can only see the people who are in front of you. And if those people in front of you aren't doing it, the social norm is not to do it, right? And so it's easy to just not do it. What's weird is I oftentimes find that the people in the back of the room are much more likely to pile on. And maybe it's because they know nobody really is seeing them except for me. And I want them to do it. And they don't want to be judged badly by their peers by, conforming to my stupid little, stomp, stomp, clap. But so when an individual's contribution to a collective activity cannot be evaluated, like, for example, if other people don't really know whether you piled on and started clapping and stomping, you can tend to get what's called social loafing, where people work less hard than they would if they were alone or doing this task completely independently. You guys are completely aware of social loafing, and it's the reason why I think most students say they hate group work, right? Because whether they themselves are the loafer or they don't like carrying a loafer, I mean, people just don't like that situation where you're now in a you're in a role of trying to get somebody else to carry their weight. I mean, it's a big burden on the group members. So social loafing is, I believe, probably one of the number one reasons why students don't like group work, because there's always a loafer. And then we also can throw in other reasons, just since I'm talking about group work, not knowing, you might have a completely non-loafing group mate, but they may work on a different schedule than you do. So you're like, I like to have the rough draft ready, a week before the due date. And your group mate's like, I like to get my rough draft done in the form of my final draft on the night before it's due. Like, people have different ways of working, and that's another frustration with group work. But we're talking about social loafing right now, so let's talk about social loafing. So people are working less hard than they would do if they were alone. Now, something that I think makes group work punishing to students also is because an individual may feel obligated to display what's called social compensation, where one individual, maybe a couple of individuals within a group, depending on the size, expend much greater effort because they don't trust that the rest of the group is going to step up and do their part, or they've already displayed that they're social loafers and they're not going to do their part. So what can happen in group work is you end up with one or maybe two people doing everything, and then the other members of the group sort of riding their coattails. And so you end up with some resentful social compensators and some semi-guilty but kind of glad they didn't waste their time social loafers, because the work got done, they got the same grade, and they're basically satisfied, but they might feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. And so basically what you end up at the end of group work is a bunch of people who are experiencing negative emotions. And so I really reserve group work to very specific tasks. And I try to make sure that those tasks occur in class so that you can't say I'm busy or other things, like the hard work is done in class, because it's just too easy to socially loaf or to blame each other. Or I've had so many students who say, just, let me do it myself. I just want to do the job myself. And, because they don't want to end up carrying other people. And so group work is difficult, and it's because of these tendencies. So why do people socially loaf? Well, being in a group makes it such that you can kind of get away without being evaluated, right? The individual group member may never be evaluated. And so in that situation, and throw on top, maybe my performance isn't going to be directly independently evaluated. And honestly, I don't care how this group does. You can get social loafing. I would tack on, this is obviously a social psychologist's model, but I would tack on, if the group's performance is unimportant to the individual, or they trust that the group's going to get it done anyway, you're going to get that social loafing. If the group performance is important to the individual and they believe that their group mates are either untrustworthy or lazy or incompetent, then we're going to get this social compensation, where an individual feels like they have to carry the group because it's not going to get done, or it's not going to get done well, or up to the level of the person who's going to be socially compensating. I got to tell you what, I had one group, and I'm not pointing any fingers. I won't tell you even what school it was, but I had one group where independently, all three members of the group came to me independently in my office hours to tell me how the other members of the group weren't carrying their weight. I thought that was pretty funny, because how can all three of you not be carrying your weight? And one of the group members said, I've done all the work. I wrote everything. And I got to tell you what, it was not a good project. I'm like, if you wrote all of this, you needed some group help. Yes, this was not very good. So it's kind of funny. A lot of times people will socially compensate even when the rest of the group is not being lazy, or the rest of the group isn't being incompetent or untrustworthy. Some people are just social compensators, where they just always believe that their performance is going to be better than anybody else's. So it's not always an accurate assessment that the individual is making about their group mates' abilities and trustworthiness and stuff like that. So here is a comparison. This is kind of an analogy to my We Will Rock You Stomp Stomp Clap. But here is the result of a study where they asked a one-member group, so that's an individual, to make as much noise as they possibly could, scream, yell, clap, stomp, whatever you want. 2 people in the group, 4 people in the group, or 6 people in the group. And what they measured was the sound pressure per person. And what you see is that a person by themselves makes a lot more individual noise than 2 people together each make, and way more noise than 6 people individually make when they're in a group. Now that makes a lot of sense. If you're alone and you're trying to make a lot of noise, you can scream to the point where you're like hurting your throat and you're smacking your hands till you're like hurting yourself, like, oh, good, I can relax a little because we're going to get more noise out of all of the 6 of us. I can relax a little. So with the noise thing, I kind of feel like, well, I mean, did you give them a clacker, or did they have to slap their own hands together? Yeah, you can make a lot more noise with 6 people, with each one putting in a lot less effort and a lot less pain. So sometimes I think that the individual is making a pretty rational decision to not, contribute at the same level that they would if they were alone. Sometimes they're making a decision that actually harms the group in the long run, because if everybody, maybe not in this example where you're screaming, but if everybody performed at their own top level, we would have 6 times as much, in this case, noise, or 6 times as much productivity, or 6 times as much energy or whatever. But instead we're going to probably, just looking at the size of this bar, this group of 6 is probably making 3 times as much noise as the individual, when you'd expect 6 times as much noise. So, by loafing, we're kind of reducing our ability to produce, whatever we're supposed to be producing, right? But most people do a little bit of loafing. So how do we reduce the tendency to socially loaf? This is good advice for you, whether you someday might be, a manager in charge of some employees, or, a manager in charge of some kind of club or something. Or if you're ever just in another group during your college education, right? Like, how can you help to motivate your group to not socially loaf, assuming that you're not the social loafer? So first off, making each person's contribution identifiable. That's a really big step to reducing social loafing. One of the things that they've been doing probably for the past, I'd say probably 10 years, maybe more like 15, I'm not exactly sure. But in scientific journals, they've started asking the authors to delineate what each author did to contribute to the manuscript. Not all journals are doing it, but like the top journals tend to be doing it. And one of the reasons why they were motivated to do that is that when controversies have arisen after publication of studies, the second and subsequent authors would oftentimes say, well, I had no idea that, this is what the first author was going to say. It's like, how are you second author and you don't know what's in the manuscript? Like, wait a second. Or they'd say, well, somebody else handled the statistics and I had no knowledge of that. So one of the reasons why they've started this listing of what each author did is so that they can't later deny it, right? And also they can't later be blamed. If honestly somebody else did the statistics and the questionable part of it is the statistics, then the other authors can say, we trusted the stats whiz, we listed that. I had nothing to do with the stats. So it protects them too. But one of the things I took from that when the scientific journals started doing that is that when I do group work in my classes, I tend to do it for like capstone and stuff like that. Is that I make the members of the group delineate what each of them did. What did you do to contribute to this final product? And, in my class, they have to produce a manuscript and a poster presentation that we do on the last night of class. So what exactly did you do? Because everybody thinks they did more than they usually really did. And so by being accountable, knowing that you're going to have to say, well, I created the PowerPoint, or, I crunched the numbers, or I was the editor on the manuscript, or whatever. If you have to delineate, also it frees the students up. So if I always encourage them to have like maybe one of you write the intro and the conclusion, one of you write the method, and one of you write the results, right? Like break it up, be specialists, don't be redundant. And then somebody else be like the overall editor, things like that. And that way, if let's say the method is really awful, but the rest of the sections are really good, then I can then, lower the score of the person who wrote the method without necessarily harming the people who didn't do that part. You know what I mean? Like, so break it up a little bit and make each individual responsible for part makes it less likely that they're going to loaf. Also, one of the nice things about that strategy is that if your person who's in charge of the method just doesn't follow through, I tell the group, just turn in what you have, and only that person who didn't do the method will be harmed, right? Because I can figure out from their poster and stuff what really happened. And plus I make them do most of their work in class, so I get to watch them doing it. So it's a good way to make their contribution identifiable without having to make the group mates like tattle, things like that. And that way each member knows you are going to be personally held accountable for parts of this project. And that way they're a little less, I have to say a little less, because I still get social loafers, even though I try and set up these, I try and follow these rules, I still get some social loafers. Providing rewards for high group productivity. So this would be really relevant in, sales situations, or, if you have a group that's putting together products, at a factory or something like that, you can provide rewards for the group, each contributing and being productive together, right? Not just everybody gets 1/6 of the, value of the widget that they made, but instead, if this group actually makes extra widgets beyond what we expect, or whatever it is, we can really encourage that. And that discourages social loafing, because you'll make more if you can make more money if you actually make more widgets. And I've had a little bit of difficulty translating this rule perfectly into group work in class. But I do, for example, a group who has an entire paper and nobody flaked and all the sections are, they do tend to obviously get a better grade than groups who have a missing section, because they couldn't really encourage their classmates to get their work done. And so, working together as a group and having a goal, trying to reward that is an important thing. Making the task meaningful, which is what I try to do in my capstone class. I have the students generate an idea for a research project. They collect the data for the research project. They write up the manuscript and they present it as a poster. So it should be meaningful to them because it's something that they came up with and that they liked. It's also complex. right? It's a complex task. There are a lot of steps to it, some of which are things that the students have never done before. And then hopefully it's interesting to them. If you can have a task that the group members are engaged in, each individual is going to want to be performing because they want to be involved in the project. They want to be involved in the task. And so as a supervisor or a teacher or something like that, if you can design activities that the group is interested in, I have a tendency when I'm designing group things, like in this class, we have group discussions, right? I try and come up with topics that I'm hoping are inherently interesting, and with a little bit of freedom within each task that you can kind of tweak it for your own personal interests and like that. So trying to think of ways to make the task something that each group member wants to perform. But of course, people vary, and levels of motivation vary within an individual across time. And so it's not always going to be perfect. I mean, you do the best you can. Social loafing is something that we see in all cultures. Every culture has, people who are not interested. They, don't even necessarily want the reward per se. Maybe they don't feel committed enough to the group. So all around the world, we see social loafing. We do see that it is more pronounced in individualistic societies, and really the individualistic societies are really the ones that are most likely to say, I'd rather just do it myself, right? Just let me do the whole thing. I'd rather do 3 times as much work as long as I could just do it by myself and not have to work with this group. And an individual who's in a group may feel like, in an individualistic setting, may feel more like it's important to be true to themselves. And if this task is boring to them or demeaning to them or pointless to them, they're more likely to say, well, I'm not going to do this. Whereas in a collectivistic society, they might say, well, I can't let my group down. So I have to contribute and I have to do my part because, this is my group. So while we do see it cross-culturally, we do see some little nuanced differences in how the two different kinds of cultures tend to interact. All right, let's go ahead and take a little break, and we'll come back in the next section. We'll talk about social impact theory as an explanation for social loafing.